Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, by Michael Lewis. Introduction. I want you to picture something. It's a sun-drenched baseball field in San Diego, back in 1980. The air is thick with tension. A handful of the most promising high school baseball players in the country are lined up for a 60-yard dash. These aren't just kids, they're investments. To the seasoned scouts watching, with stopwatches in hand, these boys are collections of tools: the ability to run, to throw, to hit with power, and to field. They're looking for the next superstar, the perfect athletic specimen. And then there's one kid who stands out. His name is Beane. He has what the scouts call the good face. He's tall, lean, impossibly handsome, and blessed with every physical gift imaginable. When the race starts, it's not even a contest. Beane smokes them all, finishing 3 full strides ahead of the second-place runner. The scouts can't believe their eyes. They check their stopwatches, measure the distance again, and make the boys run a second time. The result is the same. Beane is a phenom, a can't-miss prospect, a 5-tool player destined for the Hall of Fame. He was the kind of player you could dream on. And yet, he failed. Utterly. He became a footnote in baseball history, a classic case of unfulfilled promise. His career was a quiet, frustrating story of a man who couldn't live up to the impossible expectations set for him. Now, why am I telling you this? Because that failure is the secret ingredient to one of the most incredible stories in modern sports. It's the story of how that same Beane, years later, as the general manager of a small, forgotten baseball team with no money, would go to war against the very system that had once crowned him king. Today, we're diving into Michael Lewis's masterpiece, Moneyball. This book has sold millions of copies and was turned into a blockbuster film, but it's so much more than just a baseball story. At its heart, it's a manual for the underdog. It's a lesson in how to find value where no one else is looking, how to challenge centuries of conventional wisdom, and how to use your mind to beat opponents who have every advantage. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the secret art of winning an unfair game. You'll see that the principles that allowed a small team from Oakland to compete with the mighty New York Yankees are the same principles you can use to navigate your own life, your career, and any field where the odds seem stacked against you. This is a story about questioning everything you've been told is true, and finding a better way. Let's begin. Book summary. Imagine a world where the rules are simple. The person with the most money wins. It's not a very inspiring world, is it? But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that's exactly what professional baseball had become. It was ceasing to be an athletic competition and turning into a financial one. At the top of the food chain were teams like the New York Yankees, with a payroll of over $126 million. They could afford any superstar they wanted. And at the bottom, teams like the Oakland Athletics, with a payroll of just $40 million, less than a third of what the Yankees were spending. The gap between the rich and the poor was enormous, and it was getting wider every year. The consensus was clear: poor teams were destined to lose. They could only afford the broken, the old, and the inept, while the rich teams scooped up all the premier talent. But a funny thing was happening. One of those poor teams wasn't losing. The Oakland A's, working with one of the lowest payrolls in the entire league, were winning an astonishing number of games. They were making it to the playoffs year after year, even taking the mighty Yankees to the brink of elimination. The commissioner of baseball, Bud Selig, called their success an aberration, a fluke that couldn't be explained. But it wasn't a fluke. It was a revolution. And at the center of it was that same Beane, the failed phenom, now the general manager of the Oakland A's. See, Billy had learned a painful lesson from his own life. He had learned that what baseball scouts thought was important, The good face, the perfect body, the 5 tools, was often an illusion. He was living proof that the conventional wisdom of baseball was deeply, fundamentally flawed. He had been the perfect-looking prospect who couldn't handle the mental pressure of the game. The moment he failed, he would go looking for something to break. He couldn't cope with imperfection. It wasn't just that he didn't like to fail, it was as if he didn't know how to fail. He saw other players, guys who didn't look the part at all, succeed where he couldn't. His minor league roommate was a scrappy, undersized player named Lenny Dykstra. Lenny didn't have a fraction of Billy's physical gifts, but he had something far more valuable. He had no concept of failure. He was, as Billy put it, so perfectly designed, emotionally, to play the game of baseball, he could forget any mistake instantly and draw strength from every success. Billy was the opposite. He was haunted by his failures. And in that contrast, Billy began to see the truth. I started to get a sense of what a baseball player was, he said, and I could see it wasn't me. It was Lenny. That personal failure became the driving force behind his new philosophy. He knew he couldn't outspend the Yankees, so he had to outthink them. He set out to find inefficiencies in the game, looking for players who were undervalued by the traditional scouting system. He was looking for baseball's equivalent of Island of Misfit Toys, players who had some perceived flaw that made them cheap, but who could still do the one thing that truly mattered: win baseball games. But what was that one thing? What truly led to wins? The old baseball men would tell you it was things like batting average, or stolen bases, or runs batted in RBIs. They loved players who were fast and athletic. They loved players who looked good in a uniform. Billy Beane wasn't interested in what the old baseball men thought. He had walked into an organization that was already in the middle of a quiet revolution, started by a man named Sandy Alderson. Alderson, a former Marine and a Harvard-educated lawyer, knew nothing about baseball when he was hired as the A's general manager. But because he was an outsider, he was able to see the game with fresh eyes. He questioned everything. And he stumbled upon the work of a little-known writer, a man who worked as a night watchman at a Stokely Van Camp pork and beans factory in Kansas. That man's name was Bill James. And Bill James was the hidden architect of the Moneyball revolution. Working in near total obscurity, James had decided to apply a scientific method to baseball. He didn't care about the romance or the tradition of the game. He cared about what was true. And he discovered that baseball statistics, as they were commonly used, were a language of lies. For example, the stat that everyone used to judge a hitter was batting average. But James proved, through careful analysis, that a team's batting average had very little to do with how many runs it scored. What mattered far more were 2 other statistics: on-base percentage and slugging percentage. On-base percentage measures a player's ability to not make an out. Think about it. In any inning, you have 3 outs. They are the most precious resource a team has. Anything a player does to avoid making an out, whether it's getting a hit or drawing a walk, is incredibly valuable. Slugging percentage measures a player's ability to hit for power, to get extra bases like doubles, triples, and home runs. James showed that these 2 stats were far and away the best predictors of how many runs a team would score. And yet, the entire baseball establishment was obsessed with other, less important things. They fetishized the stolen base, even though analysis showed that unless a player was successful at least 70% of the time, attempting to steal a base actually hurt the team more than it helped. They loved the sacrifice bunt, which is literally the act of giving away one of your precious outs. This was the new knowledge. It was a secret language that only a few people understood. And when Billy Beane took over the A's, armed with this knowledge, he realized he had found his edge. The rest of baseball was shopping for players based on what they looked like, using flawed and outdated metrics. They were buying the wrong things. This meant that the players who had the skills that truly mattered, like the ability to draw a lot of walks and get on base, were being systematically undervalued. They were bargains hiding in plain sight. This brings us to the heart of the Moneyball strategy. Find the undervalued assets. Billy and his brilliant young assistant, a Harvard economics graduate named Paul DePodesta, turned the Oakland A's front office into something that looked more like a Wall Street trading desk than a baseball team's headquarters. They didn't care about a player's age, or his body type, or whether he ran fast. All they cared about were the numbers. Over and over again, the old scouts would fall in love with a player. "The guy has a great body," they'd say. "He's a tools guy." And Billy would just shake his head and say, "We're not selling genes here." His point was simple: we're not drafting players based on how they look. We're drafting them based on what they can do. And what they needed players to do was get on base. The 2002 amateur draft became the ultimate test of this philosophy. The A's had lost 3 of their biggest stars, Jason Giambi, Johnny Damon, and Jason Isringhausen, to richer teams. As compensation, they were given an unprecedented 7 first-round draft picks. This was their one chance to rebuild the entire organization. The draft room was a battleground between the old world and the new. On one side were the scouts, men who had spent their entire lives on the road, trusting their gut instincts. On the other side was Billy Beane, and Paul DePodesta with his laptop, armed with statistics and probabilities. The scouts presented their favorite prospects, athletic, handsome kids with a lot of upside. Billy systematically rejected almost all of them. "He can't hit," he'd say. When a scout would protest, arguing that the player's swing just needed some work, that they could reinvent him, Billy would shut it down. "Pro baseball's not real good at reinventing guys," he'd say. "They are who they are." Then, Billy started putting his own names on the draft board. Names the scouts had barely heard of, or had dismissed entirely. One of them was a college catcher named Jeremy Brown. When Billy announced they were going to talk about Jeremy Brown, the scouts either winced or laughed. Jeremy Brown was, to put it kindly, not a physical specimen. He was a bad body catcher, as one scout put it. Another chimed in, "It's soft body. A fleshy kind of a body." The jokes got worse. "If you put him in corduroys," one scout said, "he'd start a fire." Jeremy Brown was the opposite of the 5-tool prospect. He was slow. His body was doughy. He didn't look like a professional athlete. Baseball America, the leading publication on amateur players, didn't even list him among the top 25 catchers in the country. But Paul DePodesta looked at his laptop and saw something else. "He's the only player in the history of the SEC with 300 hits and 200 walks, he announced to the room. 300 hits and 200 walks. To the old scouts, that was just a bunch of college numbers. But to Billy and Paul, it was a signal. It was evidence. This kid, despite his bad body, had a rare, almost genius-level understanding of the strike zone. He knew how to get on base. He knew how to not make outs. He had the one skill they valued above all others. The scouts were horrified. "Billy, does he really belong in that group?" one pleaded, as Billy moved Jeremy Brown's name up into the first round on their draft board. And that's when Billy laid out the core of his entire philosophy. He looked at his scouts and said, "We're blending what we see, but we aren't allowing ourselves to be victimized by what we see." They weren't going to be tricked by appearances anymore. They had been victimized by what they saw when they drafted Billy Beane himself, the perfect body who failed. Now, they were going to trust the data. They took Jeremy Brown with a first-round pick, shocking the entire baseball world. And they didn't stop there. They built their entire 2002 team around this principle. To replace the mighty Jason Giambi, one of the best hitters in baseball, they didn't try to find another superstar. They couldn't afford one. Instead, they broke Giambi down into his component parts and tried to recreate his production in the aggregate. Giambi had an on-base percentage of .477, meaning he got on base nearly half the time he came to bat. So, they went out and found 3 players who other teams viewed as defective. First, there was David Justice, a former superstar who was now 36 years old and considered washed up. But Billy and Paul's research showed that the one skill that doesn't decline with age is a player's ability to control the strike zone. Justice still knew how to draw walks. They were buying his skill, not his athleticism. Second, there was Scott Hatteberg. Hatteberg had been a catcher for the Boston Red Sox, but he'd suffered a nerve injury in his throwing arm and could no longer throw. His career was considered over. But Hatteberg, like Jeremy Brown, was a master of the strike zone. He rarely struck out, he drew a lot of walks, and he wore pitchers down by seeing more pitches per at-bat than almost anyone in the league. His on-base percentage was excellent. The A's signed him for less than $1 million and decided to teach him how to play a new position, first base. It was an experiment. He was terrified. He'd never played first base in his life. He spent the off-season with his wife hitting him ground balls on a tennis court. The third player was Jason Giambi's own younger brother, Jeremy Giambi. He was slow, a terrible fielder, and had a bit of a reputation for being a partier. But, you guessed it, he had a phenomenal on-base percentage. This was the team they assembled. The Island of Misfit Toys. A collection of players that no one else wanted, each with a wart, as Paul D. Podesta called it. A catcher who couldn't throw, an old slugger who couldn't run, and a slow-footed party boy. But they all shared one hidden virtue: they knew how to get on base. The rest of the baseball world looked at the 2002 Oakland A's and predicted disaster. They had lost their 3 biggest stars and replaced them with this. But something magical happened. That team, built on a foundation of overlooked statistics and undervalued players, went on one of the most incredible runs in baseball history. In the middle of the season, they won 20 consecutive games, setting a new American League record. The final game of that streak was a drama so perfect you couldn't write it. The A's jumped out to an 11-0 lead, only to see it completely evaporate. The game was tied 11-11 in the bottom of the 9th inning. And who came to the plate to pinch hit? Scott Hatteberg. The catcher who couldn't throw. The man who was supposed to be out of baseball. On the first pitch he could drive, he swung. And he hit a walk-off home run to win the game. The entire stadium erupted. His teammates mobbed him at home plate. It was a moment of pure, unscripted joy. A player that every other team in baseball had discarded as worthless had just delivered the most iconic moment of the season. It was the ultimate validation of the Moneyball theory. They had found a secret inefficiency in the market, and they had exploited it to build a team that could compete with giants. They finished the season with 103 wins, tied with the Yankees for the most in all of baseball, on a payroll that was a fraction of the size. In their own division, the final standings were an almost perfect inverse of team payrolls. The richest team, the Texas Rangers, finished in last place. The poorest team, the Oakland A's, finished in first. The story, however, doesn't end with a World Series championship. For the 3rd year in a row, the A's lost in the first round of the playoffs. And this is a crucial part of the story. The Moneyball system was designed to give a team the best possible chance of winning over a long, 162-game season, where skill and probability eventually win out over luck. But the playoffs are a short series, a crapshoot, where luck can overwhelm skill. The old guard of baseball seized on this. "See," they said. "Their system doesn't work in the games that matter." The TV commentators, like Hall of Famer Joe Morgan, insisted that in the playoffs, you have to manufacture runs with bunts and stolen bases, the very strategies the A's had proven were inefficient. They missed the point entirely. The A's hadn't lost because their offense failed. They had actually scored more runs per game in the playoffs than they did during the regular season. They lost because of bad luck and a few poor pitching performances. But the narrative was set. The nerds with their computers had been defeated by the grizzled veterans who understood the human element of the game. But the idea was already out. The speed of the idea was faster than anyone could control. Other teams, other owners, started to pay attention. The owner of the Boston Red Sox, John Henry, a man who had made his fortune using quantitative analysis in financial markets, saw the parallels immediately. He tried to hire Billy Beane away from Oakland for a record-breaking $12.5 million. In a moment of intense soul-searching, Billy turned it down. He remembered his one other decision based on money, signing with the Mets instead of going to Stanford, and he refused to do it again. But it didn't matter. The revolution had already begun. The Red Sox hired a brilliant, young, 28-year-old Yale graduate named Theo Epstein to be their GM, a man who viewed Beane as his role model. The Toronto Blue Jays hired Beane's right-hand man, J.P. Ricciardi. And the Red Sox even hired Bill James himself as a senior advisor. The secret was out. The club of old baseball men who ran the game was being invaded by outsiders who trusted data more than they trusted tradition. They understood that the goal wasn't just to buy players, but to buy wins. And to buy wins, you needed to buy runs. The market for baseball players was inefficient, and those who could see the inefficiency, who could see the value in the fat catcher, the aging slugger, and the pitcher who threw funny, held the key to winning an unfair game. Commentary. When you really step back and look at Moneyball, you realize it's not really about baseball at all. Baseball is just the laboratory where a powerful idea was tested. At its core, this book is about one of the most fundamental challenges we all face. How do you make good decisions in a world that is filled with noise, bias, and outdated conventional wisdom? The lesson of Billy Beane and the Oakland A's is that the answers are often found not in gut feelings or tradition, but in data. It's about having the courage to ask a simple, powerful question. What does the evidence actually say? For decades, baseball was run by men who trusted what they saw with their own eyes. They saw a player with a good body and assumed he would be a star. They saw a player who was slow or overweight and wrote him off. They were, as Michael Lewis writes, victimized by what they see. They couldn't see the hidden variables, the plate discipline, the on-base percentage, that were the true drivers of success. This story is a powerful reminder that our intuition, as valuable as it can be, is also deeply flawed. We are all susceptible to biases. We fall in love with appearances. We overvalue flashy, dramatic actions and undervalue the quiet, consistent, and often boring habits that truly lead to victory. The player who hits a towering home run is a hero. The player who patiently works the count and draws a walk is often an afterthought. Yet, Moneyball proves that the walk can be just as valuable, if not more so. And that brings me to the most profound lesson of this book for a young person starting out in the world. You're going to enter fields, whether it's business, or art, or science, that are dominated by an old guard. There will be people who tell you, this is the way we've always done things. They will judge you based on criteria that might have very little to do with your actual ability to contribute. They will look at your resume, your school, your appearance, and make snap judgments. Moneyball gives you a different way. It teaches you to look for the market inefficiencies. What skills, what qualities, what approaches are being undervalued in your chosen field? Is everyone chasing the same glamorous 5-tool credentials, while ignoring the less sexy but more effective skills? Can you become the Scott Hatteberg or the Jeremy Brown of your industry? Can you find your value in a place no one else is looking? To do this requires two things. First, you have to be willing to be an outsider. You have to be comfortable questioning the experts. Bill James wasn't a baseball player. He was a factory night watchman who loved numbers. His distance from the game allowed him to see it more clearly than the people who were paid millions to run it. Second, you have to have the courage to trust the numbers, even when they tell you something that feels counterintuitive. The A's had to endure ridicule for drafting a fat catcher. They had to ignore the TV announcers who screamed that their strategy couldn't work. They had to have faith in their process, even when the short-term outcomes were frustrating. As Paul DePodesta said, it's about looking at process rather than outcomes. Too many people make decisions based on outcomes rather than process. That is a life-changing piece of wisdom. So, how can you apply this today? Here are a couple of simple things to think about. First, identify your own on-base percentage in whatever you're trying to achieve. Whether it's getting good grades, learning a skill, or building a business. What is the one metric that truly matters? The one that is most predictive of success, but is often overlooked. Is it the number of hours you study? Or is it the number of practice problems you complete without looking at the answer? Is it the number of networking events you attend? Or is it the number of meaningful follow-up conversations you have? Find your true north metric and focus on it relentlessly. Second, start looking for your own inefficiencies. What are the valuable skills that other people in your field are ignoring? Is everyone learning to code in Python, but no one is learning how to write persuasively? Is everyone focused on building a huge social media following, but no one is mastering the art of deep, one-on-one relationships? The greatest opportunities are often found where no one else is looking. That was the book summary of Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game by Michael Lewis. We certainly covered the big ideas today, but I'll be completely honest with you. A summary is like looking at a photograph of a great meal. You can see what's in it, but you can't taste it. The real magic of this book is in the stories, in the way Lewis brings these characters to life. It's in feeling the tension in that draft room, the frustration of Billy Beane's own failed career, and the pure joy of Scott Hatteberg's home run. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning a new strategy, it's an experience that will fundamentally change how you look for value in the world, and in yourself. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Every week, we explore the ideas that have shaped the minds of the world's most successful people. Let's keep growing together.